Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Art of Leading podcast with me, George Williams, where I unpack the career and key decisions of leaders in business to provide you with the insights you need to achieve your own success. My guest today is Zac Michaelis. Zac is the chief editor and one of the first 3 team members at TLDR News, an independent online media group that targets those aged 16 to 35 by making easily consumable digital content about news and current affairs from all over the world. In this episode, we discuss the transition from turning a hobby into a business, management techniques, TLDR's approach to strategy, and much more. I really hope you enjoy this episode. Let's get started. So Zac.
Hello, George.
Hello, great to have you here. Welcome to the pod. How are you doing today?
Yeah, very flattered to be the inaugural guest on The Art of Leading. There's big expectations.
There are. I thought we'd kick it off with a bang. So for those of you that don't know you as well as I do, tell me a bit about yourself and what you do.
Okay. So I think in this context, my main thing is that I think I work for a YouTube news company called TLDR News. I've been doing it for probably the best part of 5, maybe 6 years. Started in the middle of uni. I didn't actually technically found it. I think sometimes I'm presented as co-founder. I was by one of the other guys who sort of manages it now, called Jack. But me and another guy called Ben joined very, very early on, and when it was very, very small, and we've sort of, 3 of us have sort of built it up to, I mean, I don't want to be too grandiose about it. I mean, it's doing okay. It's not doing phenomenally well. But we've built it up into at least sort of like a commercially viable media outlet. And for people who know anything about the media space, like it's pretty tough out there. The margins are pretty tight. It's not like investment banking or consultancy, something like that. But yeah, so that's the gig at the moment. I now my title is editor or editor in chief, even though there's no other editors. But in practice, I basically write most of the content, and then I edit anything else that the other writers produce. Before it gets animated and then released to the public.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
So thank you. So I will be a bit more grandiose. So you've got, okay. I think I read you've got 2.7 million subscribers across 6 different channels now on YouTube. That's a hefty amount.
Yeah, it's very effective strategy. We just create a new channel and then the core fan base goes to subscribe again and we count them as new ones. Yeah. No, the numbers are okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I mean, it sounds like it's been incredibly successful. So tell me about sort of the content you produce. What does the channel do?
So, I think this is it's not a simple question to answer. Now it sounds pretentious again. But when we started, and I think this would be my advice to anyone who's considering doing a YouTube thing, is we had a very specific focus. We had one topic that we really talked about, which was Brexit. Yeah. And we were very, very lucky, I think. Like, we started off as a sort of like, I had a lot of free time at university. I was doing philosophy at UCL. And we started off doing like a news thing. And we were very lucky that at the time, Brexit was really kicking off. But the great thing about Brexit was that it also had like an international appeal. So I think we would have been very much limited if it had been anything else to do with UK politics. If there's like let's just say it was a 2019 election and we started doing it then, or 2017 election. But it was the fact there was this wider sort of like European context of Brexit, and that just meant that our potential audience was so much wider. And I think we also got lucky in that it was a topic that we really complemented one another. So me, Jack, and Ben, because Ben is a real sort of constitutional neek, and he he knows all about House of Commons procedure and all about sort of the ping pong passage of bills and the House of Lords and all that sort of shenanigans. I think I had always been interested in Brexit because it was sort of like, I was 18 or whatever when the vote happened, and it was sort of like your formative political experience. And then Jack has just got a real eye. It's great. He was animating the stuff. And he's always had a real eye for both like the animation and the style and the branding. He's got a real knack for that. But then also just like he's been good at sort of balancing out me and Ben can both be, I think, a bit, in some sense, too academic. We can be a bit without sort of like keeping an eye on the wider commercial appeal of the videos. So, Ben will always be pushing for like let's do one on the Salisbury Convention. And it's Jack's job to be like, no one's going to watch that. And rightly so. And I think the 3 of us really complemented each other at the time quite nicely. And so that we basically just did exclusively Brexit content for the first like year or two, maybe. And that's what sort of got us our original following.
Sure.
And then, as Brexit died down, we focused on the UK, and then sort of gradually started playing around with other like areas. And then I think, I don't know, our next sort of like big boom, as it were, was probably the Ukraine war. We did a lot of Ukraine war content. I think the news lent itself very nicely to animation style, lots of sort of map-based stuff.
Yeah.
And I should also say that the basic format of the videos is they're sort of like 8-minute explainer videos. And the sort of nominal USP is that it's supposed to be sort of quite not sort of 24/7 news cycle. There's sort of like a 24 hour delay. But it's supposed to be like a more complete look at a story than the sort of like headline 24/7 fast news cycle. So, something happens, I don't know, what's a good example? Just give an example. We did like the Mexican election happens, you're going to see a lot of headlines about it. And then hopefully 12 hours, 24 hours later, when the sort of the consequences have become apparent and the story has developed, then you get a TLDR video. It's like 8 minutes long, convenient length of time. That you can watch to really sort of like catch yourself up. And hopefully at the end of that 8-minute video, you will be better informed on that topic than you would have been if you'd spent the last sort of like on and off flitting between headlines, last few hours sort of flitting between like Claudia Sheinbaum wins in Mexico, she's left wing. You hopefully get a little bit more of a sense of the story.
Yeah.
Does that sort of make sense? Is that
absolutely. It sounds brilliant. And you do these deep dives as opposed to, the fast news that's going on at the moment with the sort of TikTok reels and all this sort of thing.
Yeah, we really struggle with short form content. We tried to do it, but I just think that you're right. Our normal USP is to do like a slightly deeper dive.
Yeah.
And there are cases where I'm actually wary of how shallow we go because, it depends on the topic you choose for the 8-minute video. If you choose a massive topic, like we did a video a while ago on like Iran's poly crises or whatever it was. And that's quite a lot to cram into, you know what I mean? You're doing the entirety of Iranian politics in 8 minutes. But in most cases, I think the topics we choose are like sufficiently narrow such that an 8-minute video is quite a nice deep dive into them. Short form content we really struggled with. We did it for a couple of almost a year, I think. And then we actually stopped doing that as part of the business because it just wasn't working for us. And I think for the reasons, but fundamentally it's the reason you just outlined, which is that the thing we do is explain us stuff, and you can't really explain anything meaningfully in 90 seconds.
No, absolutely. And in fact, I read that you get more views on average than any of the big media channels out there, such as Sky News, Wall Street Journal, Daily Mail.
Yeah.
You're obviously doing something right.
Yeah, I think, those numbers, I just am so wary of ever coming across as arrogant on anything public facing. Those numbers can be sort of massaged in any direction. But the numbers are pretty good. I think one of the things that probably it's one of the things that I think in a sense sets us apart is just that like reliably we will get a certain number of views. There's a sort of floor to a video which is normally about 100,000 views, 100,000 views. And that's not true, you're right, for other outlets. But other outlets play a sort of more like a shotgun approach to media, which is where they're just like they're piling out. Some news outlets, that output is just incredible. They're putting out like hundreds of videos almost a day. Yeah, and they're a combination of sort of like, explainer style content. And then if you're like, I think Sky News does stuff like this, but then they'll put out sort of like 15-second clips of like, windsurfer falling into a tornado or something like that. It's just the shotgun approach. And we don't do that in part because we just don't have the capacity to put out that much stuff. So we have to be a bit more selective. And I think it's quite nice having a sort of floor to your vote, your view count. And I think that's just a function of the fact that I think unlike those companies which aren't like YouTube native, they don't depend on YouTube. Like they don't have like a core base, as it were, a fan base. And we have a very like loyal viewer base. I'd say between like 50,000 and 100,000 people who will just watch almost all the content. And that, thank you very much, guys. I don't know which camera to look at, but thank you very much to those people who do watch the stuff. And I think the actual name of the game for us is really just ever expanding that sort of like core base, the core audience. And so, I think those numbers can be massaged to sort of like suit a particular narrative. I think it's largely consequent of that we are YouTube native, and lots of those other media outlets aren't. But no, the numbers are okay. They're good.
Yeah, they're brilliant. And so those media outlets we've mentioned, you target probably quite a different audience to them. I've read you target those under 35, yet to graduate onto the likes of the FT and the Economist and those sorts of brands.
Yeah, guys, skip your TLDR phase. Just go straight to the Economist. Do you want good news? Yeah.
The opposite.
Yeah.
But do you think that these outlets that we've just mentioned are particularly, out of touch with this younger generation that you target?
I do think you actually you do sort of allude to a really serious problem, I think, which is that you're right, that established, and I think in many cases, like the best news outlets, I do think, for example, the FT, by the way, they are just the best.
I do read as well.
You should, yeah. Let's just, I would encourage people to read the FT. I don't really consider them a competitor in any meaningful sense. I mean, they're just great. The issue that you're right that basically all broadsheet media, that the median reader is something like 60. It's insanely old, and then conversely, the sort of like media diet for younger people is pretty chaotic. I think is probably a good way to put it. I'm not going to put too much of a sort of normative spin on it. I'm not saying necessarily worse, but young people do take their media from like a wider range of sources. I think, to be honest, in many cases, less reliable range of sources. Like, if you get, obviously young people, there's some good data by Oxford and Reuters who do this. And obviously young people just like use TikTok or Facebook or Instagram Reels or whatever it is to get like some of their news, maybe most of their news. And it just lends itself to like I think that if people are getting their news sources from such a diverse range, you just end up with there's no sort of common epistemic ground, as it were. Like there's no like sort of basic truth. I think one of the other things about this, by the way, is that this is one of the things the best arguments for the BBC for like national news service is one of the issues in America is there's no news service that sort of like holds the middle ground, which means you end up with just like two completely different media universes, at least two completely different media universes, and no sort of common ground. And once you lose that common ground, you can't really have like a sort of universally inclusive and sensible political conversation. I think that having like a national news service that's sort of given a competitive advantage by virtue of the fact that it's taxpayer funded, and also sort of like sits on that middle ground, which the BBC does very effectively in the UK. I mean, most people still do. It's the most popular news outlet and one of the most trusted. Is very good for sort of like the epistemic health of a politic. That was needlessly pretentious, but you know what I mean. And what was the original point? Yeah, and I think you're right that is the issue is that in large part just the fact that young people get their news from such a diverse range of sources and not from places like the FT, very like established ones. And I think there is a sort of like advantage of if everyone got their news from something like the FT. We would have like I don't want to sound too normative. I don't want to basically just imply that the FT is just the best, or like the Economist is just the best, and you should do it, and that like sort of non-mainstream media is bad. But the FT does subscribe to certain journalistic standards, and it is just. And I think if the fact that young people don't really read any established media is sort of dangerous for the sort of health of political conversation. Yeah. And I hope that by sort of providing like a YouTube native sort of young person friendly alternative that, we try to hold ourselves to certain editorial standards, that I hope that we sort of like fill that gap, like provide a sort of non-mainstream media source that is nonetheless sort of like grounded in journalistic integrity and sort of editorial standards. Again, I don't want to sound too pretentious about it, but yeah, sort of like a centrist middle ground young person option.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's it is a genuine massive problem. I mean, the problem you're pointing to will only get worse over time as well, because obviously the median age of the broadsheet reader, or broadsheet's a bad example because there are broadsheets that are nonsense, obviously, but the median age of the like sort of mainstream news media, FT reader, has been going up over time, and it just means that as time passes, the fraction of people getting their news from like non-mainstream alternative media sources will increase, and the impact that has on the fact there will be no sort of political consensus, and the impact that has on like the ability of especially an electorate to have political conversations is probably negative.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because obviously diversity of thought is probably something that's quite welcomed, and and it encourages conversation.
Yeah, that's why. That's what you're articulating what I was wary of, like implying. I didn't want to say that like it's a bad thing that people get their news now from all these various different sources. Yeah. I think in a way it's that we're in a sort of like recalibration period where we haven't like we haven't quite got to the point where as an audience and as an audience and as a sort of like as media consumers, we haven't got to the point yet where we can sort of use all of these diverse media sources and yet still come to some sort of consensus. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. And a lot of these organizations that we mentioned started off with physical press.
Yeah.
And TLDR, obviously started digitally, but it's now moved into that physical press region, hasn't it? You had the TLDR newspaper recently.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think that's coming back for another sort of batch, if I'm correct. Tell me more about that sort of movement into physical press. And do you think it will play a bigger role in the future of TLDR?
So the physical press thing, I mean, it's slightly gimmicky. Like there's a sort of tongue-in-cheek element to it. I think the reason we did the newspaper and the reason we're doing the magazine, I don't want this to just become a plugging session where I just sort of stare down the camera and be like, buy my newspaper. The reason we did those things is because I think a lot of people want to support the channel. A lot of people like the content we do. And we just don't really do merch like other YouTube channels. And, we could do some gimmicky T-shirts or something like that. But we thought there's something quite sort of nice about a newspaper or a magazine. And then on top of that, one of the things that I quite like about the newspaper and magazine is because it's not subject to the same sort of like commercial demands necessarily. People aren't. It doesn't need to be as clickbaity essentially as like a video. You can include some slightly more like academic, highbrow stuff in there that we don't really get to include in the normal videos. And so I thought it was it lends itself I think it's quite a nice natural bit of merch because you want to support the channel and you don't just want to like throw money into a Patreon black hole or whatever. You can pay for the newspaper. It's almost like a collectible. It's slightly gimmicky because obviously it's print media and print media is dying. But then you also get to, I don't know, you get to dive even a little bit deeper for certain topics than the 8-minute structure allows for the normal videos. So I think it's mainly just that it's quite a nice, it's quite a natural form of merch, a natural form of like allowing people to support the channel. There's also another thing, which is that there's an element of self-interest to it in that like we've got 4 writers as well as me full-time and then some part-time ones as well. And, people come to TLDR, if you're a writer, you want to be a proper journalist, and it's quite nice getting your words down on print as opposed to just like, getting them read out by Jack or Ben or someone and, getting to have your little byline and, cosplay as a real journalist.
Absolutely.
For a little bit.
Oh, you're definitely a real journalist. But no, it's interesting that, TLDR, Too Long Didn't Read, is now moving into that longer form stuff that we mentioned.
I think also there's something about like the core audience sometimes does say like, it's a shame that you couldn't get more into this. I think the core audience doesn't just want to hear our like very neutral explainer stuff. Sometimes they do want to hear not our takes, but like what we're interested in as well. Yeah. And the magazine is a good format for that. But yeah, that'll be fun. I'm optimistic about it. I also think one of the things I quite like about the subscription model that we're going for is it just allows you to improve over time. I think one of the things we struggled with in the past is like doing like just like one-off merch things. There's no development to it. You just sort of like throw a mug into the commercial ether or a T-shirt or whatever, and then hope that people like it. Whereas there's something... there's something nice about the subscription model and hopefully getting things, improving. And also just improving like how, excited is maybe too strong, but no, I am excited about is like, I want to sort of have more sort of audience feedback, is that the right word? Like interaction. I want to, when it comes to producing the magazine in the future. So, I don't just want it to be something we just sort of foist upon people, like support the channel, hear my thoughts. Yeah. I want it to be more like, okay, we've got a couple months to the next copy. What does the audience want to hear us write about? Like, I want it to just become tailored to the point where it actually is just not just sort of like an empty means point channel, but something that's genuinely really interesting to the audience. And I think that being able to iterate over time is just great for that.
Absolutely. And it sounds to me as if this newspaper is almost a passion project of yours, something you'll really enjoy. It's got that sort of commercial viability, but it's something you're journalists, you want to write.
Yeah,
news.
I think you're right. And I'm happy. It always makes me happy to see when the writers are excited about something, because there are certain times, when you're doing when the news cycle is slow, this can be a bit of a slog. But when it's something you're really passionate about and the opportunity to get your sort of like your words in print, it gets people happy, and that's always nice to see.
Definitely. So you mentioned, you didn't found the business, but you joined very early on. In fact, I think you joined just after you had started university, after it had been around for about a year.
Yeah.
Talk to me more about sort of how you got started and what it was like in the early days.
Honestly, I just got started because I said it sort of tongue in cheek a second ago, but it's just true. I just had so much free time at university. Again, doing philosophy at UCL. I love that degree, by the way. Most people don't. Unfortunately, the London unis get a bit of a bad rep. They get very low student satisfaction ratings. I understand why that is. It's a particular experience, but I quite enjoyed it. And at the start, this is, I think, something that I didn't anticipate, which is that very quickly, when you're just three blokes and you've got no office and you have one channel and no sort of salaries really to pay and no sort of expectations from an audience because we're new to the game there. It's a very different vibe. You're not really running a proper business. Yeah. You're just sort of having fun, and over time, it's definitely become more of a real business. I think that's one of the hardest things to do is to transition from a hobby to a business, especially when you start employing more people.
Absolutely.
And it's definitely so now. Now we have quite a few employees and part-time people, and we do fancy stuff. Jack is constantly jetting around to hang out with the FT and talk to them about online media or VidCon or stuff like that. I think he's there next week. I think though for the first couple of years, I'd say it was very casual because there's nothing to stress you out in a way. We paid ourselves salaries, but not very big ones, and we had a tiny office, and it wasn't there very often. I basically worked from home, basically straight from I was working from home was at uni, and then the first year or so, I still mostly just work from home, and but then over time, it just became a very, very. I think, especially quite recently, it's become a very different gig as we try to grow and expand. And I think it's one of those things where I don't want to sound like it's not fun. It's actually it's definitely more rewarding in a way. It's a real challenge expanding a business from a tiny thing to a big thing. And I think if we make it, it'll be really rewarding. But it's definitely more taxing than I thought it would be. I think there's a part of you when you start off doing something like that, and it's so easy because you're doing Brexit as well. At the time, you didn't have to think about topics. It just happened. There'd be some chaos, and you just
the news for you to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And you just followed the news cycle. It didn't matter if you missed the story. You just sort of got it out. And then. You see what I mean here, and it was just a very different gig. And then as it becomes like a proper business, stuff becomes a bit more complicated in a way. I don't want to sound negative about it. I just think it is very, very different. And I think that's one of the things I didn't really anticipate. I sort of thought it'd be like forever doing a hobby, and it is in some sense. I've got an amazing job, and I can't ever complain about it. But it becomes something very, very different, and that's sort of natural. I mean, you can't just be a sort of YouTube, you know what I mean? You can't just sort of fiddle around in your bedroom for your entire employment. You've got to do something. And and then one of the things I didn't anticipate though is quite how different those two things would be. Quite how different running a company is to just sort of whittling about Brexit.
Yeah. And how have you found that transition? What are the things you've learned along the way?
It's a good question. I probably should have prepped for this, really. I think one of the things that's quite a lot of things that you've learned along the way.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I think one of the things is that management is harder than I thought it would be. We hired new people, and also not just hiring new people, when the sort of balance of power within a company changes and responsibilities change, and people have to take on new responsibilities. Management is just harder than I thought it would be. I thought those things would all happen very naturally, and I thought you'd just hire someone, you hire a new writer, and then just new scripts, and that'd be that. And actually, sort of making sort of people work as a sort of well-oiled machine is difficult. And when I had that experience, I talked to some other people who started small companies, and they all say that there's a certain number at which all of a sudden the bureaucracy sort of steps up a gear.
Yeah.
Some people say 20 employees. That's quite a common figure. People say 15, 20. I think for us it was a bit lower than that. And I think broadly speaking, that the business can be sort of split into 3 phases. We had our sort of like YouTube, teenage kids in their bedroom writing Brexit videos phase. And then the company grew a little bit. I'd say that was the sort of phase for the last couple of years. Let's say last like 3 years, something like that. Getting bigger, a period of sort of growth where I think we were just sort of diving headfirst into any growth avenue, as it were. We started doing shorts. We had our Instagram. We had our Facebook. We had whatever, Twitter. And I think what has happened more recently is we've refocused on the core product, which is just the 8-minute videos, because it's the thing we just do best. And like, I think a lot of time you feel like as a media company, you should have certain things for branding reasons, but because you want to have like you want to have like not just like a YouTube channel, you want to have a media business, something sexier. And I think we've learned that actually the thing that we just do best, and it's always been true, is those 8-minute videos, and we are sort of slimmed down to refocus in on those. I haven't really answered your question. You asked me like what I've learned. I don't think I can give you any too many general lessons as the honest answer. I feel like quite a lot of it is specific to the circumstance and the contingencies of the business, of this particular business at TLDR. I can't tell you, in broad strokes like Ray Dalio, here are my 10 principles. I can just tell you that I think management I thought was originally harder. But yeah, I don't mean arrogantly. I think I've got a lot better at it. I think I've sort of become good at it. I think one of the things that's really helped is that we have these like one-on-ones with new people, and just getting them to really encouraging them to criticize the shit out of me is good as a manager. You need some feedback. Otherwise, I think the manager, it just becomes an exercise in ego. You quite enjoy being in charge, and you just sort of tell people, no, you do this, I know what's right. And you have to have that like feedback mechanism. I think the other thing I'd probably learned is just so soppy, and maybe people will disagree with me in the comments, whoever's watching. But one of the things I think I've sort of learned is that I think in most cases, the demands of basically in most cases, the most effective form of management is to make sure that people are really happy. Yeah. And actually, like lots of times, it feels like those two things are in tension. You know what I mean? Like take a really obvious example in our business. It feels like sometimes you'd be tempted as a manager to like rush someone to write a script or be like, I need you to work really hard here. And those two things feel like they're in tension. It feels like I'm sort of putting strain on an employee for the sake of the business. In some narrow sense, that's probably true. But I think it's going to be fun. And I don't know if I sound like naive or delusional here, but in cases like that, I actually think there's ways of framing those sort of things to make it apparent to the people that like this is in everyone's interest. In most, if that works, for example, you can be. That's great news for the writer. I mean, they've succeeded at something really difficult, but also like the sort of general. I think because we're a small enough business in general, when the business is doing well, everyone can sort of feel it. I think in a bigger business, you don't really feel it. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like if you used to work at Deloitte. If you work at Deloitte and Deloitte's doing well, you don't really feel it in any meaningful sense. But when you're a small business, you do feel when things are going well, and it does sort of like impact people psychologically. Again, I haven't really fully articulated what I mean there, but when I'm saying like the sort of like employee making people happy is the best form of management. But I think that's one of the reasons for it. I think that's one of the lessons I have. I have a little Google Doc with like all my little strategy, all the things I've learned. Yeah. It's a little strategy doc, and that has been the biggest lesson for me. Is that in lots of cases, it's in what the right decision in management terms is often the right decision in sort of aggregate well-being terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And employees definitely come first at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think you're a startup, so a lot of these people are bought into the business anyway, and I think it's much more of a tight-knit community, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. I've never worked in a bigger company, so I can't really compare.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there is definitely like family's not the right word, but like there's a little collective sort of thing. You all know how business is doing. I mean, you can all see the numbers, as it were. It's just the view count is what counts. Everything is downstream of the view count. Yeah. So you do know, and people in general feel. That's not. Okay. I haven't sufficiently explained what I meant by the fact that management normally aligns with employee well-being. But I think there are a variety of mechanisms that make that true, and that's just one of them. Is the fact that like people know how well the business is doing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, definitely. And I think one of the quotes that sort of sprang to mind as you were talking about this is Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, when he was interviewing employees, and I'm sure you don't do this, but he would say, if this was your last year of your life, would you work at this business? And he wanted people that were that passionate to just join. And I think that's
a high bar.
Yeah, I think that's probably quite toxic in a way because, work and life, you should definitely have a balance. But I think for startup, you need that sort of passion, definitely.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's another thing is I think we're a very young office.
Yeah.
We have in the writing team. I'm the oldest. I think I'm 25. And two people we hired two new writers recently. They're both, I think, 23 and 22. And I think that makes it, in a way, easier because the people are more. They don't have fundamentally more malleable.
Yeah.
I think it's both easier and more difficult. So, like obviously because they're new to, well, all of us are new, as it were, to like the world of employment, to the corporate world. We're not polished, and there's room for some mistakes, as it were. But then one of the things I really like about the way we're doing it is that because none of us really know how these things work, A, you're learning on the fly, and B, when you get it right, there's a real opportunity to sort of like the company itself is very malleable, and like you can refix things really, really quickly, and you can redirect the company really quickly. We're still quite nimble, and I do think that is in some part a function of the fact that we basically have no bureaucracy, and we're all quite young.
Yeah.
But does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it sounds like a really exciting place to work in these days.
Well, you have to ask them. I can't speak for them. No, people do seem to like working there, and I think the job is. I do really think the job is so great because in lots of cases you're learning about stuff that's really, really interesting. I mean, there are demands, like you have to write quite quickly. One of the other things is that we obviously. Our output per person is far higher than something like the FT or the Economist, in part because we have less editing, but also because I think the sort of stuff we're writing is different to the. If you're writing for the FT, it has to read beautifully.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're writing to be narrated, it's a different thing. You have to read so that when it's read, it's very comprehensible, and that's. In terms of the prose is far simpler there because you want to repeat yourself and you want to aggressively signpost and all that sort of thing because. If you're just listening to a video, you're not paying as much attention in a way, and you need that signposting to really get the information across. And yeah, you're writing quite a lot, but you are fundamentally learning about stuff that's just really interesting. I mean, like we do a lot of politics stuff. Politics, if you're into politics, it's the dream job. I think in lots of cases, people go into, and we get to hire really great people. We put out a job advert and we get hundreds of applications. But it's because I think a lot of people go into political journalism and you go work for someone like the FT or, I don't know, Daily Mail or something like that. And the actual experience of the job is so different. You're a grunt journalist and you're not doing, of course you're not writing about the big political stories. Of course you're not, you're writing very, very little content. You're mostly just doing sort of like grunt work around the office. It's all edited quite heavily. There's very little responsibility. But the main thing is you're not reading or writing about something you're interested in. Whereas because we don't have a massive team, straight off the bat, if you work for us, you're reading and writing about politics, politics with a capital P. And that I think is the main appeal of the job. It's great for me. I literally, I am constantly just reading and learning about politics, and it is demanding. I write, I don't want to sound, I write an obscene amount of content, but I love it because you can feel yourself learning. You feel smarter for it, and that's just great. I mean, like the fact that I get paid to like self-improve in some meaningful sense, and I come out of a day feeling smarter. Yeah, it's a great thing. It's just a complete luxury. It's insanely lucky. Again, it is taxing. There's a lot to do. But it's really, really lucky, and it's really, really enjoyable. I wouldn't have it any other way. And yeah, I think that's the main perk of the job, and I think that's the reason it's really fun.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah, and so I hope people enjoy the job for that reason, because
Absolutely, and I think you'll always do best at the things you enjoy, because you put more into it.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's what I think that's we're now talking about one of the other reasons why I've always found this management aligns with well-being sort of thing.
Yeah.
In that, like, in most cases, people writing about something that they like, means that the content is better. It's not always true. There are definitely cases when people are sort of too close to a story, in which case, your biases come through.
Yeah.
The joke in the office is that in the Ethiopia content we used to do, I'm pretty pro TPLF, the Tigrayan People Liberation Front. And so that was when my personal bias came in. But especially with UK content, it's always hard. You got to make sure you're not too I think obviously parts of Office are quite left leaning, and you have to moderate that. I have to edit that out. But yeah, in general, it's stuff you're writing about. And it's also just, the relative counterfactuals, and the job that you would be doing otherwise is doing grunt work for the FT.
Yeah.
Or even worse, the Daily Mail,
Even worse.
Even worse.
So you mentioned earlier that, you started off with lots of different revenue streams, and you've stripped it down to your core of the 8-minute videos.
Well, I think the key point is that the other things were not revenue streams. That was the issue.
Side quests.
Hobbies.
But where do you see the business going in future? Do you see yourself sticking to that content that you're so good at and or expanding back out as the business grows? Where do you see it in the next 5 to 10 years?
So it's quite hard to say here. So I think two things are simultaneously true. The first is that I'm actually very comfortable with the business being this for a while.
Yeah.
I think, I think most people who found businesses, maybe this speaks to the fact that I'm not hyper corporate minded, I just quite enjoy writing about politics. I get to, again, the self-improvement thing while simultaneously getting paid is a real luxury. And, I'm quite comfortable with the business just being this and ticking up and sort of growing at, above inflation would be nice. But yeah, growing a couple of % a year, views getting better. The one of the reasons I'm comfortable about that, by the way, is that I still think there's a lot we could do to improve. We do this podcast called The Editorial, which is when we talk about all the errors we've made.
Yeah.
And actually, really getting the content right, perfect, is quite difficult, especially with the amount of content you're doing. You want it to make sure it's super balanced, super neutral. We're always trying to do the both sides thing. Well, not the both sides thing necessarily, as in we're always trying for it to just be neutral and to be honest. In some cases, that doesn't mean taking both sides, because in some cases, one side is shit and the other side is right. Make sure that the content is perfectly balanced, as it were. And then also making sure there are no errors in the animation, no errors in the scripts, making sure it's fluent, it reads nicely, it's aggressively structured for the reader, making sure it's accessible to different audiences. Ideally, you want something that my 12-year-old half-brother can, watch and love. Yeah. And also a PhD student, doing geopolitics at Imperial. You want it to sort of cross that divide. That is not easy, and I still think there's a lot of stuff we could do there. Some of the content isn't perfect, and I don't like that. I think there's actually a fair bit you can do just in sort of perfecting the current business.
Yep.
And I'm very comfortable with being a small business fundamentally. I'm very comfortable with just being a small business that ticks along for a little bit. I also think there are different revenue streams available, but I think that the way I see it is that they're all downstream of the core products. Merch is a good example. I think we could do better merch. Yeah. I think and not just because I'm desperate for your cash, but also just because I think we've produced some pretty fun stuff in the past. The magazine, again, I think will be good in the long term at least. I think that doesn't require a meaningful restructuring of the business. You're still just mainly doing 8-minute videos, and then you have this sort of merch thing. People who want to support you and interested in the content you make on the side. But I'm quite happy with that just being the core business. I mean, you can expand into new channels. We have 1 million channels that we want to do. Just we can't because we don't have that many people. But we have a TLDR business channel that we've just sort of started recently. And getting that to speed, that takes time. It's doing well. It takes time. We always want to do we had a TLDR US channel for a while. We folded that back into global because it didn't do well enough. The US media scape is very concentrated. It's a tough world out there. Yeah. You're desperately fighting for views. we also, I've always wanted to do, for example, like a TLDR eco. Always wanted to do like an environmental channel. It's very hard to get views on environmental content, but I think, at some point in the future, we can maybe do that. My little brother does biochem at Oxford, and he's constantly lobbying me for a TLDR. We don't normally hire that nepotistically, and we're not going to. But he wants to do like a TLDR science. He's always been talking about, which I think there's a thing in that,
Absolutely.
And there's ways of expanding the business without really meaningfully changing it. And I actually just think that that's probably the way forwards for the foreseeable future. I mean, it leaves you open to certain vulnerabilities. I mean, fundamentally, we're very dependent on YouTube, on the health of YouTube as a platform. That's fine. YouTube's been around for a long time. There's a sort of Copernican reasoning that just implies that YouTube has been around for 20 years. I'll give it another 20 at least. I'll be fine. I don't know, nuclear war would put off by then. Well, who cares? But yeah, I actually I quite like, at least in the short term. Sorry, I said there was two things. The second thing's coming. That at least in the short term, just sticking with the current structure, as it were, and that's being our main product. It's a thing we do well. Like, again, with the media thing, the media is a difficult business. The margins are not good. At the moment, a lot of media companies are struggling. Quite a few have gone bankrupt, I think. I don't pay that much attention to it because they're bad news. But I think, a lot of them do struggle for numbers. And it means that, it's not easy to just sort of like take your success in that particular 8-minute video format and sort of transpose it to short content or transpose it to Instagram. Those are different markets, and they're very concentrated as well. They're difficult to win at. So I think I've sort of happy with focusing on the core product for at least a bit. I still think it could be better. That's my main thing here. And then sort of using merch as a sort of offshoot of that, but still centering in on that. And the second thing is that, like, what was the second thing? Wait, the second thing. Yeah, I also think that in part because I basically think it's redundant to plan too far ahead. This is probably terrible management or business advice, but I think we found it relatively redundant to plan too far ahead. And I think that's because we're a news business fundamentally, and that like so much just depends on the news cycle, it might be that nothing happens, AI comes and I don't know, I'm going to sound so sort of technologically illiterate here, but it might be that AI comes and that just sort of like wipes around, not just our business, but then also provides, enormous GDP growth rates and world peace is quickly achieved. And then we just go bankrupt, fine, But conversely, it might be that, like, I don't know, the Ukraine war was a good example of something that we just like were constantly doing, and it was our sort of bread and butter for a while. But it might be that, I don't know, Britain goes to war with Russia, in which case probably pretty, it's pretty content. Good. Yeah, great content. If it bleeds, it reads, baby. And then all of a sudden, I think it'd be a completely different thing. We might have to hire new people. We might have to turn it into something. We have to get a Moscow office. But you see what I mean? I think so much of it is like contingent on the news cycle. I am also just generally wary of planning too far in advance. I think that's like a reflection of sort of like my own psychology. And just like my own experience with life. But then also, I think it's something we've sort of figured out for the business. I think actually there's more utility in focusing quite narrowly on the next like 6 months, and that being your strategic focus. I think in our experience, sort of planning longer has been a bit difficult / redundant.
Yeah, no, I think you make a number of good points there. I mean, strategy is always important, but being able to flex that as the situation comes.
I also think strategy requires quite a lot of sort of bureaucratic capacity.
Yeah.
Like, you were a strategy consultant. Yeah, there you go, exactly. You're the expert on this. But like, it requires quite a lot of effort and thinking and time to come up with a longer term strategy. We're not a big business. We don't really have that in us. We don't have the capacity. You can't just be like, okay, let's all just take a couple of weeks and think about the next 5 years.
Yes.
We're desperately chasing the news.
Yeah,
we barely have enough time to write a crap magazine. It's not crap, buy it. But it's you see what I mean? It's different.
Yeah, absolutely. And a number of businesses that were digitally native, such as yourselves, have really struggled. BuzzFeed and Vice, I think neither of them are profitable, and which you guys are, as far as I've read. So I mean, you're clearly doing something right.
I think, by the way, on this, I do think that is just I don't know enough about the internal machinations of those two companies, but I know a couple of similar examples. I think the news movement, we do quite a lot of stuff with. They're founded by Kamal Ahmed from the BBC and some other dude, Chris something. Oh, anyway. But they do similar stuff to us.
Yeah.
I think the thing that we do well that keeps our overheads low is we are very small. A lot of journalism businesses get very big very quickly. I understand why. I sort of understand why. I don't actually 100% understand why. I think that lots of them are sort of like associated with people who've come from mainstream media. and broadsheet journalism. I think in part because broadsheet journalism used to be a lot more profitable. Broadsheet journalism has a lot of editing, has a lot of bureaucracy. It's a big sort of thing. And I think one of the things we've done really well is to stay really small and agile. And I'm always wary of ever getting too much bigger. For the reasons we talked about earlier on this, was about the whole bureaucracy thing and the sort of exponential increase in bureaucratic costs as you sort of get towards 20 people or whatever it is. And then I can only imagine what happens when you get towards like 100 or 1,000 people or whatever. But, you know, we have 4 writers and we cover everything. And I edit everything. And, you know, to be frank, I do still write most of the content, you know. And I think there's just a real utility to that. Like, it's a really efficient setup. I think if you have all of us, you know, I think basically it turns out the most efficient way of doing journalism is to, I don't mean this arrogant. I really don't mean this arrogantly. It's to just have one bloke who can do all the editing.
Yeah.
Instead of having a head editor and then a sort of like Middle East sub-editor and then a Africa sub-editor and then within those a Lebanon correspondent, Syria correspondent, you just need it. I mean, obviously it limits the quality and quantity of our content because I can't literally edit a million words a day or whatever it would be, but I think you can produce too much content. I think we produce the right amount of content for someone with a healthy relationship with the news. And B, it's just the most effective way of keeping bureaucracy down.
Yep.
But yeah, so I think lots of those companies hire so many more people than we do. They make more money than we do as well, and they have different revenue streams. A lot of them, for example, have investment. We have no investment. And despite what some of the commenters sometimes suggest, we get a lot of stuff about, you know, the CIA funding us, which is always flattering. But yeah. A lot of those just so much bigger. That's what always shocks me whenever you go talk to those companies. It's just how much bigger they are and how, like, relative to their output. You know, like the news movement puts out like so many videos, but not in terms of actual lengths, maybe not much longer than we do.
Yep.
But they had like 40, 50 people. You know, all on like pretty big salaries, and you're just like, well, how? I know what numbers you guys get. Like, how are you affording this? Yeah. And I think something similar is true of other news businesses that well, I'm not saying they overhire, but they hire more than us. Yep. And I think that's the key difference. Is we are just small, and I think because I am terrified of getting any bigger, and I don't want my job. Part of it's just selfish. I don't want my job to change. I love my job, and I don't want to end up just like not reading and writing about politics. I don't want to end up just managing. Yeah, not be fun. And so that's, you know, and that's one of the things that people always warn us about. You know, talk to other YouTubers who've started off small and then get bigger, but they're always talking about how it starts off more fun and then you become a manager, and that's a different job entirely.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and there's definitely something to be said for being small and agile. And I think I read that there's multiple of 3 rule in business that, you know, as soon as your employees tick up by that multiple of 3, you need a complete overhaul of your systems, your processes.
That's a cool little rule. So as in like you get 3 times as many employees?
Yeah, so let's say you start off with, you know, 1 person, then you go to 3. You'll need to sort of reorganize your management.
That's
3
so
to
interesting,
9.
That's entirely plausible, because we started off with 3, and I think 9 was literally when all of a sudden we were like, oh, bureaucracy.
Yeah, we need to rethink about things.
Yeah, okay.
So, you know, when you scale fast, you know, you're quickly going through those layers of bureaucracy that you just sort of adjust to. And I think often people don't. And that's when you become inefficient, as you mentioned, and it becomes harder to stay afloat.
I think it was really, and also it required pretty aggressively and pretty consciously like stepping on the brakes to stop doing it, because it's so natural. You just feel like you're growing and employing more people, and then like when the bureaucracy gets bigger, you're like, we need an office manager. Well, we must, you know. And you need an office manager for the office manager, and it required really quite a conscious we have to slow down. This is clearly not, we just have to like think a little bit more about like, do these things make money for starters, and then like be like, how is this all going to fit together as a company? And I honestly, so I think as I start so many sentences and never finish them. You know, as I was saying, I think there's 3 phases of business. I think when we started off, when we were Brexit, and then we had this sort of like period of growth, and I think now we have this period of like consolidation, is not shrinkage. Consolidation is probably a better way of putting it. And I think if we like pull this off and we get to a point where I'm really happy, that'd be the most like, well, the thing I'm probably like proudest of doing in business, because it really did require a very conscious step on the brakes and being like, whoa, where's this all going? Yeah. And it's not natural, because you feel like you're failing when you cut down things. Yeah, you stop doing Twitter or whatever it is. You just feel like, oh, you know, we should have made that work. But it's just rational. You know, you try something, it turns out it's a bit shit. You got to stop it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a lot of trial and error. So you're a politics business. So I'm going to question you on some politics now.
Go on. This is more fun. Sorry, I wasted so much time talking about that stuff. But yeah, go on.
No, it's been brilliant. So Jeremy Hunt recently announced that he wants the UK to be the next Silicon Valley, as he's termed it. And I think Cambridge was actually the area he was looking at.
Yeah.
What do you think the UK can do to encourage more small businesses and startups like yourselves?
Oh, so I couldn't say anything too specific about us.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that is so the whole Silicon Valley stuff. It's a couple of things. There's a quite a difficult one to unpack here. So I think that there's the UK does have like sort of native economic advantages. It has an amazing educational sector.
Yep.
I often think this is something Dominic Cummings used to talk about. I'm not endorsing him more generally, but he was right that fundamentally the UK has an internationally competitive education sector, and especially when the US is consumed with, well, the US education sector has become volatile in lots of ways, and it has become sort of like, whether or not this has been led by Congress or by the education sector themselves, it has become consumed with American politics. That was our main competitor. You know, we should be taking our education, especially our university sector, seriously. That's a massive advantage, and we, you know, sort of downstream of that, we do have a really pretty strong like sort of R&D sector that covers Silicon Valley stuff. I mean, some of the issue is about international investment and the size of the sort of like capital markets in the UK. That's why the US just does so much better. I don't think there's an easy solution to that. People, you know, politicians often talk about that, especially in the European context. You know, Macron has always talked about how to deepen European capital markets, but like there's not an easy way of competing with America on that front. Something that's probably true is that the UK does quite a lot of good R&D, but is very bad at capturing value from it. And that's because I think that's actually a cultural thing in some part. Like it's all done in the sort of like golden triangle of Oxford, Cambridge, and London, and that's just mainly like nice and fluffy academics. It's not sort of cutthroat Silicon Valley dudes like it is in America. This is all very high level. I appreciate this is probably too general to be that insightful. But the other thing I'd say is that I think one of the issues here is that actually investing in like those sort of high tech growth driving industries that the UK already has quite a good base for, conflicts with some of the other political demands for government. Most obviously levelling up, basically.
Yeah.
And the Treasury has this constant dilemma of whether or not do we invest in the sort of like highly productive and actually sort of like revenue generating places like Oxford, Cambridge or London, but therefore exacerbating regional inequality, or do we redirect that funding up to the north, even though it's not going to, you know, you can talk about it, but like fundamentally it's not going to be as effective in sort of driving those high growth industries if you invest it in the north as it is if you invest it in Oxford or Cambridge. So, you know, I think that's some of it. I also just do think, and I've been thinking about this a bit, Rachel Reeves basically makes this argument whenever she's quizzed on how Labour is going to fix all the structural problems in the UK economy without doing significant tax and spend. And it's not entirely plausible. She basically just says growth is going to fix it. And then you go, how are you going to get growth? And she says, we're just going to grow. You're shaking your head like, oh, that's so silly. But one of the points she makes that I am actually increasingly sympathetic to is just that the bare minimum stability would be good for that. And that's stability not just in like a political sense, but also like stability in the tax system, stability in the planning system, all that sort of thing. And Labour is clearly very conscious of those sort of like, it's not a tax and spend issue, it's like a sort of regulation issue. And Labour is very conscious of the sort of like regulatory hurdles to investment, especially in the planning and tax system. And they are going to make moves towards fixing those things. And also, she's right that basically, if you look at the politics in America, it's still an amazing economy, and the numbers just don't lie. But I do think, in a sense, that the economic downsides of political chaos are underpriced in America. And I think at the same time, Europe is looking volatile in certain respects. I think that, you know, too much can be made of this whole like rightwards shift in Europe. The picture's more complicated. But I do think the EU has struggled to find like sort of like economic or geopolitical agency. And I don't know if that will change. And so in that light, you know, I do think that basically having a nice sort of friendly, sort of pro-business, New Labour-esque Starmer government in number 10 has real value from the UK perspective. We'll basically be the only stable place in the world. That's great, you know, why not? So yeah, you know, there's no answer there, but there's some stuff to be done.
No, absolutely, and I think stability would go a long way. And I think one of the main issues from my perspective is just the culture we have here. You know, you look to America and everyone's got their 401ks. You know, everyone's sort of invested in the economy. You know, when Trump gave out those sort of tax credits.
Oh, in the COVID thing.
Yes,
Yeah,
all of
okay.
that, and it went straight into the economy. And you know, if you gave that to the UK, I don't think the population would do that.
Have we got time?
We've got a minute.
Okay, I think there's two separate things there. I mean, the first is the American attitude to stimulus. But America can do that in part because it's got the world's reserve currency. So America and Europe have very different attitudes to you can see them in reaction to the financial crisis. Yeah, America does stimulus, we just knuckle down, do austerity, and America clearly wins. Yeah, but they can do that because they can borrow more money because they are the world's reserve currency. So I think that's one of the relevant differences there. There's something psychological, but there's also just that sort of bare fact. The other thing is that you're talking about like the 401k thing. There's something that Jeremy Hunt is constantly talking about is that we do have pension funds, but pension funds are not really investing in the sort of like high growth industries. I think this is in part because actually America has long proven high growth rates in the equities market, so people just do naturally invest in America, but also because there are regulations that prevent pension funds from investing in like higher risk assets in the UK. And that's something that Jeremy Hunt is conscious of, and so is Rachel Reeves. So maybe that will change in the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And anyway, I think that's time.
Namaste.
But yeah, no, thank you very much, Zac. It's been brilliant to talk to you today. And
Thank you.
I think that's been very interesting for everyone.
I hope so. Can never be sure. But yeah, thank you.